Firstly, we're going to be just talking about carbohydrates in general and their structure. So overview, carbohydrates all have the same basic framework and are categorized into different groups based on size. So most common example of a carbohydrate right here is glucose, right? All carbohydrates use a ring structure, very similar to this, where they have an oxygen, carbons, and then they have OH groups sticking either down or up. And then it's not shown here, but there's in the opposite direction is pointing an H group, right? So this one's going up, this one's going up, this one's going down. And then at the end here, they have this CH2OH, right? This end. This ring is called a saccharide ring. Shown here is glucose, a monosaccharide. So monosaccharide is only made up of one saccharide ring, as shown here, glucose. This is the simplest form and the form that our body uses the best. However, there are also disaccharides, which are two sugar rings, polysaccharides, which are a couple of sugar rings, and then oligosaccharides, which are many sugar rings. Okay, and some of those we get a variety of those from different foods and different carbs, like classic carbs like flour, wheat, things like that. And those give different types of carbs and different types of molecules. And our body generally tries to digest them by breaking them down into this one, glucose, right? Or into something very simple that it can digest easily. So talking about polysaccharides, saccharide rings can be combined together to form more complex sugars, as shown here. A glucose and a fructose can combine to form sucrose, a disaccharide, right? And you see here, this used to be an OH, right? And this used to kind of be an H as well, OH as well. Over here on this fructose, if you notice, this fructose is a little bit different than this one. This is a 5-membered ring instead of a 6-membered ring. We'll get into that in a bit, but they can be 5 or they can be 6-membered, these sugars. And they undergo something called a dehydration reaction, which we talked about earlier when we talked about peptide bonds, right? If this had an OH, this had an OH, got rid of one from each side, and you ended up with this, right? You ended up with one OH and one H gone, so H2O, and then this bond formed like this. All right, and this, I do think you should maybe know this one specifically, this disaccharide. It's called sucrose, and the reason you should know it is because this is table sugar. This is what we usually use to like sweeten our foods, like put in our coffee or make cake with, called sucrose. It's a combination of glucose and fructose. So the site of binding is the C1OH of one sugar and either the C4OH or the C6OH of the other sugar. This bond is called a glycosidic bond. And like I mentioned, it's a dehydration reaction to form this bond. In this case, it's a 1,4 glycosidic bond because it's between carbon 1 and carbon 4, right? So you always number starting here and going this way is how you always number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one would be 6. And then again here, start with the O, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Again, 5-membered rings have only 5 carbons, whereas 6-membered rings have 6 carbons, right? And obviously you can't form a 1,6 glycosidic bond with a 5-membered carbon because it doesn't have a 6th carbon. So when you're doing glucose with something like fructose, it's a 5-membered ring, has to be a 1,4 glycosidic bond, but there are some cases where you'll make 1,6 glycosidic bonds, and just know that you don't. I don't think you really have to know too in depth into the differences between them, like the real details. But no, there are 1,6 and 1,4. Okay. So as I showed before, there's 2 different types of rings. They're called pyranoses and furanoses. Pyranoses are the 6-membered rings, which have 6 carbons, and furanoses are 5-membered rings with 5 carbons. Glucose is the prime example of a pyranose ring. Fructose is the prime example of a furanose ring. Next, we want to talk about how to actually name these. So in the ring format, the determining factor of naming a sugar is the direction that the OH is pointing. So if you see here, some of these OHs are pointing up and some of these are pointing down. This is extremely important because if you reverse it, it's a completely different sugar, completely different molecule, at least in this ring structure. And that's how we name it. So the C1OH is especially important as it determines whether something is alpha or beta. Pointing downwards is alpha while pointing upwards is beta, as you can see here. And you can kind of interconvert these. There are reactions that interconvert these, but this is alpha glucose, alpha D glucose, which I'll cover the D as well in a second, and beta D glucose. For the remaining carbons, the direction of the OH determines the name of the sugar. I should actually say, for these at least, right? For example, for glucose, it's always up, down, down, up, down, right? So you can see here, down, up, down, up, down. Wherever you see glucose, it's always going to be down, up, down in that order. If you instead went down, 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 it's no longer glucose, it's a different sugar. For these next ones, 2 to 5, right? And for the final one, the C6, the direction of the C6 carbon group determines whether it's D or L, where up means D sugar and down means L sugar. The majority of sugars you'll see will be in the D configuration because that's the most stable configuration. That's just like the natural configuration. So you'll almost always see like this, where it's D, but just so you know. Okay. And like I said, I don't expect you guys to know this right away, and that's why I'm not asking poll questions. But this is something that you're gonna have to memorize, and it's just one of the things that you'll have to memorize for naming carbohydrates so far. Next, we want to talk about epimers and animals. I always see at least 1 or 2 questions on the MCAT, it's very similar to this, where they ask you, they give you something like glucose and galactose, and they ask you what are these 2 molecules called, or what is the name of this relationship between these 2 molecules? And it's called an epimer. So 2 sugars which vary at exactly 1 carbon are called epimers. Most common example is glucose and galactose, which only differ at the C4 carbon. All right, so like I mentioned with glucose, goes down, up, down, whereas with galactose goes down, up, up. I'm sorry, could you guys mute? Just. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, so down, 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 up, down, and this one is down, up, up. The only difference is in this 1 carbon. Okay, and that's what's called an epimer. We'll also be covering these Fissure projections in a second, but you can also see the difference here in this Fissure projection. These are all the same. However, this one red is different. Anomers are epimers, but they vary at the C1 carbon. So like I mentioned, the C1 carbon determines if something's alpha or beta. So if you have an alpha glucose and beta glucose, they are anomers of each other because they are epimers as well, because they only vary at 1 carbon, but that carbon is at the C1 carbon. So anomer is a more specific, more descriptive word for that. Okay. So next, we want to talk about Fissure projections. Fissure projections are the linear way to draw sugars instead of in a ring. You may be asked to convert from one form to another, and they're drawn like this, where it's the C this way, and then it has this double bond O, this OH. It can be converted into a ring, right, by using this O, forming a ring structure. And you actually may be asked to convert from one way or another. And the way you know which molecule this is based on the OH. Instead of up and down, it's left and right. So you can see here, it goes left, right, right, right. Okay. So next I want to talk about, and last I think for naming carbohydrates, I want to talk about the difference between an aldose and a ketose. So an aldose comes from the word aldehyde, and ketose comes from the word ketone. So if you notice, some sugars like glucose have an aldehyde, right? And this is talking about the Fissure projection. You don't see it in the ring. There's another way to look at it in the ring, but the aldehyde is only present in the Fissure projection because it becomes like this in the ring. So you can see here it's an aldehyde and it's starred for you, and this is the carbon actually they started, which made it very nice in this diagram. And ketose, you can see here, this is a ketone, not an aldehyde anymore. This is called ketose for like something like fructose. An easy way to determine whether it's an aldose or ketose if they give you a ring, which I don't know if they would because that's a little bit tricky. They usually, I think, will give it in a Fissure projection or they'll tell you. But in case they do, if the cyclic form has two CH2H groups, it's a ketose, right? So you can see here and here, or this whole thing, I should say. It's ketose. If it only has one, it's an aldose, like right here. The one we've been looking at, glucose, is an aldose, so it's easy to see. But yeah, to know the difference, especially in the Fissure projection. But I would also suggest learning it here. And I would suggest this is a good diagram just to also learn when you're converting from Fissure to the ring. This is kind of a good idea of what happens essentially. So because they start it, so you can see this is this carbon, and this is this carbon. You can kind of see the mechanism kind of how it rings up. I didn't show the mechanism here because I just think it's a little bit too complicated and too involved to kind of go over. And I don't think they'll ask you specifically about it, but if you want to, I would suggest looking up the mechanism just for your own like understanding, because they may not ask you, but it may help you to understand this concept better. But this is also a good diagram to show it. Okay, any questions before we move on to our next topic in the chat? Or if anyone wants to raise their hand or anything about anything I covered so far, about just naming about what a carbohydrate is. Okay, if there are none, we'll move on. And if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to share as I'm going through. We have another tutor, Janelle, here, who will answer questions in the chat.